some people in a state could be empathetic, and it's quite possible that we have empathetic leaders, but is it possible for a state to be empathetic? And the example that I raise here, is it possible then for us to ban the death penalty because we have a certain kind of empathy? So can one be super empathetic to the point of being dangerous? And this is an issue that we should discuss when we're talking about robotic intelligence, right? Is it possible that whether you want an operation or not, an intelligent robot is going to say you're going to have an operation? Is it possible that at some point, when in the future a great-grandson of yours says, I don't want to go to university, the robot will come and say, you're going to university and that's it. You're not going to have an option here because I know what's really good for you. So the issue of who is going to define a whole plethora of things around free will and agency and a multiple number of ethical issues are raised by this, from my point of view. So I thought, just while I had the floor, because Kim may not let me up here again, that I would bring to your attention this book by Daniel Frankfurter. Daniel was trained as a historian of religion and as a social theorist and as a cultural studies professor. And his book raises some very interesting questions, and that's why I told Kim that he should have a quick look at it. Frankfurter's book argues that when we talk about things like evil, we have to see that it is rooted in the very deepest part of our cultural consciousness. That evil itself is not something that you can bandy about without any kind of rules of the game attached to it. And therefore, the most important thing that he, for me, underlines is that the whole notion of evil has arisen out of our religious roots. And religious roots continue to play a very important role in the way that we construct our world. The issue I have is, with robotic intelligence, will it have religious consciousness? And this will raise, for me, some very important issues, and for Frankfurter, it raises some important issues about evil. How is evil made concrete? Billy Fluter made evil concrete for me, right? I could read all this stuff in the Bible that my father said this is evil, but that had no register on me at all until I got beaten up, several nights in a row. And then I said, well, this guy is evil, The second thing that Frankfurter says is that there is no notion of cruelty that's universal, and Kim alluded to this in his first remarks. So how are you going to define what evil is, then, if there is no universal category of evil that is registered in human culture? So that raises, for me, a really red flag about Simon's use of the word science of evil, because that implies something that I don't even think is there. At least when I use the word science, I imply, or I suggest, that it's universal. In effect, then, one of the critiques I have of his book is precisely that evil and cruelty and lack of empathy and zero negative and all of these things are not transferable one to the other. What he has done in his book really is to hyphen off things that are gathered around the empathetic word and created a kind of template of what he thinks the science of that might be. But it is not rooted in what I would call the way in which humans have experienced evil. And here are some of the things that I think you should think about. Why do we think that evil is larger than us? That is, why is evil bigger than each of us? Why is it considered or often spoke about as a realm or an environment or an evil empire? I mean, why is it that that term can jibe with the way people are seeing things? Well, it has to do then with our human conception that evil is associated with a realm that is in another dimension of existence. It's beyond this realm in some way, shape, or form, and yet it is not limited in time or space. It's a very interesting phenomenon. So what Frankfurter said is, he says, look at the way that we have experienced evil, and you can see that, you know, witches, we no longer think that witches are demonic. We no longer think that, you know, chaos is necessarily chaos. We examine things now from a multiple number of perspectives, and so we think that evil is something out there and probably universal, but we don't define it as local only. And that's, I think, a significant thing. Secondly, why is the definition of evil often in the hand of authorities? i.e., why did we listen to Ronald Reagan? And why did his characterization of Russia set the tone for the Cold War at that particular moment? Well, it's because somehow or other, the whole issue of evil is resonance with guys like Kim and me and professors and theologians and philosophers and big type guys. So we use this kind of language, and because of our position and because of who we are, that language takes on more authority. And so that filters down to everybody. And so the definition of evil often is, I would argue, very limited. It's limited to an authority system that we buy into. Thirdly, what role does fear play in the definition of cruelty and of evil? He doesn't deal with this in his book very much. And so I think if you're going to unpack the whole notion of empathy, then you have to unpack fear too, because it's an emotion that is involved in empathetic feelings. And what role does conspiracy play in the meaning of evil? Well, I don't think I need to tell you about this because we've just been through another 9/11 memorial type thing, huh? And all of the conspiracy theories around 9/11 have now grown, like Topsy. There are all kinds of theories about the evil that have grown around here, all the way from the United States government wanting to appear that it wanted to take out some people, and so it did this via the airplanes, and the whole idea of why they didn't shoot these planes down. All of this has raised huge conspiracy theories, which I don't have time to go into, but it's only the most recent thing that has to do with this continuation of evil. So here you go. Here's my bottom line on Baron Cohen. I have supreme difficulties with his quote measurement of empathy. How can you categorize my experience of empathy with Billy Fluter? Where would that put me in any kind of scale? I don't know where you would put it. And so therefore I have huge doubts about the whole attempt to measure empathy. And while I admire his attempt to give these type B and type N and other kinds of things a clear definition, the fact of the matter is that what he does in his book is only use particular case studies as illustrations of this. So I don't see this as having a scientific basis. I think it has a metaphorical basis. I don't think it has a scientific basis, but maybe my definition of science is off. Then secondly, I've already talked to you about the circuitry ideology, but I think, you know, you have to be very careful in talking about the brain and its circuits. I'm not sure that we know enough about the brain yet that we can really talk about this with any kind of conviction. So I am cautious about his use of the circuitry model for how he sees empathy working. My third critique has to do with cruelty, evil, lack of empathy, and all that as one set of phenomena. I just don't believe that. I just don't see the evidence for that. Are there differences between personal lack of empathy and the social perception of evil? So in effect then, if I am not empathetic at one point about one particular thing, am I therefore evil within that context? And would the social community in which I live define me as evil? And what does that do to international law then? What does that do with law if in fact the definition of the social perception of evil is going to drive the way in which we categorize empathy? And finally, why is evil behavior apparently limited in time and scope? As far as I know, we don't throw witches in jail anymore. What does that say about the evil that witches were supposed to bring with them? And what does it say about the way in which we define evil to say that at this moment they're evil and at this moment they're okay? So in effect then, I raise huge issues about whether you can find empathy as a kind of dominant way of orienting yourself in the world that can be scientifically registered with any kind of clarity. Those are my issues with Brian Cullen.